Kenneth Roth, it's a privilege to have you in the Full Story studio. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You grew and led Human Rights Watch for 3 decades. During that time, the organisation took on dictators, exposed, documented and campaigned against some of the most egregious human rights abuses, from China to Syria to Rwanda to Israel. And you've written about that and more in your memoir, Righting Wrongs. What motivated you to write this book now?
Well, when I would tell people that I defended human rights, you could see this look in their eye. They would say, "Oh, isn't that nice? Well-intentioned, but you can't get anything done, can you?" And so I wrote the book to show that we can get things done, that the human rights movement is not about just, wishful thinking, that it's about playing hardball. It's about putting pressure on governments to force them to change. And I describe in the book, how we do that, not abstractly, but with concrete stories, with case after case where we made life better for the people on whose behalf we were working.
Before we talk about some of that work, I want to go back to the beginning where you start the book, and you write about your grandfather and your father fleeing Nazi Germany. How much did that play a part in your desire to make human rights your life's work?
That was a big motivation. My father grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, and fled in July 1938 as a 12-year-old boy for New York. And so I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with stories about what it was like to be a young Jewish boy worried about the Nazis, worried about the brown shirts beating him up on the playground, worried about, my grandfather being arrested. And so I was very aware of the evil that governments can do. And I think that's a big part of why I decided to devote my life to try to prevent atrocities of that sort for anybody.
And in the book, you document some of your encounters with powerful heads of state, with military leaders, with officials in governments that you're investigating and accusing of abuses. How did you prepare? How did you strategize for meetings like that?
Well, these were obviously very high stakes meetings because, I was aware that I had an opportunity to meet with, this thug and to try to change them. And so I would prepare first by working very intensively with the Human Rights Watch researcher who was assigned to the country. And we would really talk through in quite a bit of detail, not just what I was going to say to the dictator, but what the dictator was going to say to me. Because I needed to be able to respond and make it clear to the dictator that we had the goods, that whatever facile answer he was providing was not going to be adequate, and that the only way he was going to avoid immediate disaster was by changing the behavior. So these were, important meetings. But then when you walk into the meeting, you often have to make almost an immediate assessment. And you do this really by judging how you're being received, the nature of the handshake, just, little intangible things. But you've got to decide right off, is this going to be a potentially constructive conversation where we can talk about solutions, ending human rights violations? Or is this going to be a bash him on the head kind of meeting where the point is just to show him that while the sycophants around him may be telling him that everything is fine, that's not reality. And that if he continues down the abusive path that he is following, he's going to have terrible consequences in terms of, disaster to his reputation, losing benefits that he seeks from the international community, the kinds of pressure that Human Rights Watch was able to bring to bear. And so, very quickly you have to make that judgment and then make the most of the meeting.
I was surprised about the way that you spoke about shaming being a powerful tool against tyrants, against abusive governments. Why? And what if shaming doesn't work?
Well, shaming is premised on the fact that in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. This has become a basic aspect of its legitimacy. It's a way of saying, we, the government, are serving the people of our country, not just ourselves. And so they all pretend to respect human rights. Now, obviously, they don't.
Is that changing with particular regard, for example, to Trump's America?
Well, if you ask Trump, what do you think about human rights? He would say, what are those? He could care less in the immediate sense. But even Trump is shameable. And you see this, for example, in how he has had to modify his immigration deportations because, there was support for him to kind of reinforce the border with Mexico, but not support for these raids into neighborhoods and workplaces where he's just picking up random people who speak Spanish. You see it even in Gaza, where global outrage at Netanyahu's starvation strategy has forced even Trump to recognize that there's starvation and to vow to do something about it. Now, whether he's going to do enough is an open question, but it shows that, even Trump cannot be indifferent to the effort of the human rights community to spotlight, this discrepancy between the pretense of respecting human rights and the ugly reality. So I think it works actually with every government. It works, even with Xi Jinping. And I tell the story there of how, while China seems to be indifferent to pressure, in fact, when Human Rights Watch was able to create a vote at the UN Human Rights Council about whether China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang should be a formal matter of discussion, Xi Jinping himself was calling heads of state around the world, getting them to vote with China. You don't do this if you're indifferent.
I want to focus on Gaza. Just this weekend, an estimated 300,000 people turned out in Sydney to protest against Israel's starvation and slaughter of Palestinians. The Harbour Bridge protest was opposed by local authorities, and of course in the UK we've seen the Labor government there ban the Palestine Action Group. Do you see that kind of activism, of protests, working in tandem with your kind of activism?
Absolutely. In other words, Human Rights Watch is good at investigating and exposing atrocities and generating media attention to them, which is an important part of shaming. But another way to shame governments is for people to take to the streets or even to just, write letters or post on social media, anything to indicate that they are disturbed by what is going on. And even dictatorship, certainly a democracy like Australia's, leaders have to be attentive to what the people think. And so if there is this visible manifestation of public outrage at something that's going on, a government has to react. And I'm certainly hopeful that the Australian government reacts to the Sydney Harbour Bridge protest by reinforcing efforts to force Netanyahu to change. And in this case, it really means Australia encouraging Trump to force Netanyahu to change, because Trump really is the key to the ongoing starvation strategy in Gaza. If Trump were to turn off the spigot of U.S. military aid and arms sales, Netanyahu would have to change immediately. And Trump's refusal so far to do that is, not only allowing this to go forward, it's aiding and abetting a genocide.
And I want to talk a bit more about what Western nations can do in a moment. But you write in your book that during your time at Human Rights Watch, no aspect of your work was more closely scrutinised than your reporting on Israel. Why do you think that was?
It was because there are very well-organized groups whose entire purpose is to criticize anybody who criticizes Israel. And they often have, deceptively neutral-sounding names, but it's all about defending Israel. And no other government had such an organized constituency backing its war crimes. And so at Human Rights Watch, I just learned to live with that. It meant that we had to be, super careful, but in fact, we were always super careful. So I learned very early that as long as we were factually accurate and principled in the criticisms that we made, we were simply applying the same standards to Israel as we applied to 100 other countries around the world, we were fine. Let them criticize. We would win those public battles because what we put out was accurate and justifiable.
In Australia and around the world, we've seen many instances where those who do criticise Israel, they come under attack or they face pressure not to speak up. It's in some cases been described as a new McCarthyism. What kind of silencing tactics or attacks or pressure did you personally face?
Well, at Human Rights Watch, obviously, sometimes donors would try to pressure you not to criticize Israel. And that was relatively rare because most people who contributed to Human Rights Watch understood that we applied the same principles every place, and that's what they supported. But, every once in a while you would lose a donor, and that's just the price of being principled. That's okay. Sometimes we were accused of anti-Semitism. And I, learned to live with that too. But in fact, I've come to understand that people who use charges of anti-Semitism to try to silence criticism of Israel are actually undermining the very important fight against anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is a real problem faced by Jews around the world. But if people come to believe that accusations of anti-Semitism are really just efforts to diffuse or silence criticism of Israel, that cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism at a point when it's really needed. And this is, in essence, a prioritization of defending the far-right Netanyahu government over protecting Jews around the world. It is a cynical misuse of the term anti-Semitism that actually undermines the important fight against it.
You write about your work investigating abuses in the occupied territories going back to the 90s. More recently, in 2021, Human Rights Watch found that Israeli authorities were committing apartheid, but that's something that its allies continue to dismiss. And just last month, you wrote a piece for The Guardian about the reluctance of Western nations to recognise Israel's genocide in Gaza. Why? What would it take for Western nations to recognise that?
Well, first, in terms of apartheid, I should say that Human Rights Watch did a very lengthy, detailed report showing that what the Israeli government was doing in the occupied territory was clearly the kind of oppressive discrimination that is outlawed by both the UN Convention Against Apartheid and the International Criminal Court's founding treaty, the Rome Statute. And this was a detailed legal analysis. The finding of apartheid has been reaffirmed by every serious human rights group that has looked at the issue. Increasingly, governments recognize it. The International Court of Justice recognized it. At this point, I think it's pretty indisputable that the status quo in the occupied territory is one of apartheid, and that's why the status quo is untenable. It's unacceptable. We need to move toward, either a two-state solution or a single state with equal rights. Now, with respect to genocide, and I wrote about this in The Guardian, I think that part of the reluctance to recognize the genocide that is indeed taking place in Gaza today is twofold. I mean, one, it's just conceptually difficult to imagine a state that was created as a haven for Jews from the genocide of the Holocaust, that state could now have a government that is committing genocide. There's a certain cognitive dissonance there that people have to overcome. Sadly, that is what's happening. The fact that a people were victims of genocide some time ago, decades ago, in no sense precludes that government committing genocide today. That's what's happening. But, overcoming that cognitive dissonance is one factor. The other is that I think our view of genocide tends to be colored by the experience of the Holocaust, or for that matter, something like the Rwanda genocide. And what they have in common is that after a certain point, the Nazis in Germany, the Hutu extremists in Rwanda sought to kill every Jew, every Tutsi they could get their hands on. This was a genocide aimed at a people in whole, to use the terminology of the Genocide Convention. But genocide is also defined in the treaty as an intent to destroy, in part, a relevant group. And that is just as much genocide. And that, I think, is the way to understand what's happening in Gaza today. In other words, Israel is not trying to kill every single Palestinian. It's trying to kill enough Palestinians and create conditions of life that are sufficiently unsuitable to life that it will force the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza to flee to Egypt. That's the ultimate aim here. This is genocide for the purpose of forced deportation or ethnic cleansing. It's still genocide, even though only a part of the Palestinian people are being killed. And we have to understand that. That's what the legal definition encompasses, and that's what's going on.
Ken, we've heard over recent weeks a lot of talk from Western leaders about recognising Palestine. Several nations are expected to do that at the UN in September. Is that a deflection? Does that overlook the far more urgent and pressing need to stop that violence that you speak of?
Your question, I think, is the right one. I don't want to minimize the importance of recognizing the Palestinian state. I think this is, first, appropriate outrage at the genocide. It's a symbolic step, but it's a way of governments saying what Israel is doing in Gaza is utterly unacceptable. And the fact that, France, Canada, the UK are doing this, Australia probably will do this. These are all important steps, but we should not fool ourselves to feel that this is changing anything on the ground in Gaza. And so what's needed in addition to recognizing a Palestinian state is pressure on the Netanyahu government to stop its killing, to stop its starvation strategy. And, because any single nation, certainly Australia, has limited direct influence over Israel, there are things they can do. They can sanction people. For example, Australia has sanctioned people for violence in the occupied West Bank, but it's not sanctioned anybody for the killing that's happening in Gaza. So that would be important. Australia could reaffirm its support for the International Criminal Court, regardless of who is charged, including Netanyahu. It hasn't explicitly done that yet. So there are important steps that Australia could take. But I think in many ways, the most important one is to put pressure on Trump to in turn pressure Netanyahu. And this can be done in a way that I think is politically plausible, in the sense that, of course, Australia doesn't want to provoke Trump. It doesn't want to get into a tariff war. But if one were to, play to Trump's ego and to say, look, we need Trump to use his deal-making skills to, bring a positive conclusion to the horrible conflict in Gaza, that's a palatable way to go forward. And I think it's needed because Trump needs to be pressed to stop closing his eyes to the slaughter, to stop, facilitating the starvation, and to really bring it to an end, which he can do by simply saying tomorrow the United States is going to stop its massive arms sales and military aid to Israel unless this horrible genocide stops immediately.
There have been moments over recent months that have felt that we might be on the brink of a turning of the tide. We hear leaders harden their language, but then nothing seems to change. If you were still at Human Rights Watch, if you were meeting with world leaders, if you were meeting with the Australian Prime Minister, what would you say to him in trying to convince him to support Human Rights Watch, stop the atrocities in Gaza?
I think every government needs to use its capacity to speak with Trump, to put pressure on him or encourage him, if you want to put it positively, to use his leverage with Netanyahu to stop this intolerable situation in Gaza. That's the way it's going to stop. Trump has already showed that he is distancing himself from Netanyahu. He's done this in, some areas outside of Gaza. He, lifted sanctions against the new Syrian authorities, even though Netanyahu didn't want that. He negotiated directly with Hamas, with the Iranians when Netanyahu didn't want that. He cut a deal with the Houthis that doesn't even include an end to attacking Israel. He forced Netanyahu to accept a couple of ceasefires in Gaza. He's pressing Netanyahu now to allow more food in. But none of this has been enough. What he needs is really an order to Netanyahu to open Gaza's borders, to allow the 500 to 600 trucks per day of aid that were coming in before Netanyahu imposed a blockade. That's what it's going to take to stop the starvation. And we need to say that over and over, the Australian government and everybody else, to force Trump, to force Netanyahu to stop the genocide.
A moment ago, you mentioned two options, a two-state solution or a one-state solution. And there are a lot of advocates for a one-state solution, people who want one state with equal rights for all. Do you see that as a viable option that Western governments could ever support?
I mean, in my view, that would be fine. I'd be okay with a single state and equal rights for all. And in many ways, Israel has forced that option upon us by expanding the settlements so extensively that, I've spent time in the West Bank, and if you go up on a hilltop and you look down, you're looking at a Swiss cheese of Palestinian settlements surrounded by, the Israeli occupation settlements, the outposts, the bypass roads. All of this divides up the West Bank. So it's hard to imagine the kind of contiguous territory that would be needed to sustain a state. But of course, this could change. Israel could withdraw. So, yes, there might be one state. If there is one state, it should be equal rights. It should not be one state with apartheid over the Palestinians. The far right Israeli extremists want to expel the Palestinians. That's their solution. Start with Gaza, get rid of 2 million there, then move on to the West Bank, and you solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. That's their vision. That's now Netanyahu's vision. That's the purpose of the genocide. I don't think one state with equal rights is going to be palatable to the Israeli government. Apartheid is not palatable to everybody else. It shouldn't be. Mass expulsion is a massive war crime. That should not be allowed. So I think that brings us back to what is really, the least bad option, but I think the only long-term viable option, which is a two-state solution. An Israel and a Palestine living in peace side by side. That, I think, as a practical matter, is what we should be pushing for.
One thing that I've heard many people say over the last 21 months is that the system is broken. They've lost faith in international law. What is your response to that?
I mean, international law, because there is no formal enforcement mechanism, there's no international police force or international military that is going to, force governments to respect the law. It does, and it always has depended on governments to take the political decision to enforce that law. And it's always been done inconsistently. The fact that today Trump is really more a problem for international law, an impediment to the law, rather than an enforcer of the law, is actually not that unusual. We had the George W. Bush administration that already then essentially declared war on the International Criminal Court, that was creating a gulag of torture cells around the world, and disappearing people into them. And we've had bad eras in the past, which we've been able to overcome through public pressure. So the fact that, the superpower is undermining international law is not the end of the story. The way we've gotten past that in the past, and frankly, Australia has often played an important role here, is that we have found repeatedly that if we put together coalitions of governments, and typically it's been about 60 governments from all parts of the world that are committed to support human rights, we can overcome the resistance, not just of the United States, but also of Russia, of China, of other governments that really have no interest in seeing human rights enforced. We did that to get the International Criminal Court created. We did that in other stories I tell to get a treaty banning landmines, a treaty banning cluster munitions. These efforts were all opposed by the superpowers, and we won anyway because we put together a critical mass of governments that believed in human rights, and we can.
And as we wrap up, I've heard you say many times that people shouldn't despair, that there's always something that people can do. How have you maintained that optimism despite the cruelty that you've witnessed?
Well, in a sense, this comes back to my book. That's what the book is about. I title it Righting Wrongs because there is always something you can do to right the wrong. There's always an angle. There's always a strategy that will successfully put pressure on a government. You got to figure that out. And what I do with the book is to, illustrate a bunch of examples, not only as a description of the past, but as suggestions for the future. These are things that worked for us. They could work again. Maybe it's going to be something different, but there's always something you can do. And that's what kept me going, because obviously I was dealing with the horrors of the world. I was dealing with horrible tragedies that had been imposed on people. I took that information in because I knew I could deploy it and make people's lives better tomorrow. And seeing that succeed time and time again is what kept me going. It gave me, the positive energy I needed to keep the work up and to continue making a difference in people's lives. Do that again now.
Kenneth Roth, thank you so much for your time, your insights, and your advocacy. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.